Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. On behalf of Crosby, Kemper, I want to thank you all for participating in this year's Central Library Maximum Capacity Utilization Test. You can all go home now. You know, from time to time over the past few years, especially when we've had, seriously well-attended programs, some of you have asked me, is this the biggest event yet? You can stop asking me that question. This is the biggest event we've ever done. This is the biggest event we'll ever do. I'm retiring tomorrow. Not only is this the library's biggest event ever, it's also the grand finale of our biggest big read ever. As most of you know, this fall we've been celebrating Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer under the auspices of the National Endowment for the Arts and in conjunction with the Kansas City Ballet. When we learned that Hal Holbrook could join us, we extended the big read through this coming Sunday. So now, here's the big question. How many of you have read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer? Oh, I like that, but I don't see all your hands. The good news is you have until Sunday. You can still check out the book. Or listen to our audio recorded version with 24 local celebrities, starting with Mayor Sly James. You can listen to it on our website, kclibrary.org. Go there tonight and start up. Well, but tonight you're going to hear and see the unmistakable voice and the extraordinary presence of one of America's most beloved actors. For more than 50 years, Hal Holbrook has toured across the country and around the world in his phenomenal one-man show, Mark Twain Tonight. In his new memoir, Harold, the Boy Who Became Mark Twain, he tells us about how all this came about, plus much, much more. You can hear his voice in every sentence. The effect, like being with Hal Holbrook in person, is mesmerizing. Tonight's program is in the form of a public conversation conducted by my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Library Director Crosby Kemper III. There will be some time afterwards for a brief question and answer period. Following that, Hal will be personalizing copies of Harold, the Boy Who Became Mark Twain. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hal Holbrook Tonight.
You've won Emmys and Tonys, been the most mature person to be nominated for an Academy Award.
That's nicely put.
Yeah, thank you. You've played presidents, lawyers, robbers, humorists, but I am repeating myself. Sorry, that's a Mark Twain joke that he's used. I'm stealing his material, but he stole it from Mark Twain first, so it's okay. And yet here you are, back where you started, on tour in the Midwest. I mean, your theatrical career really started in high school auditoriums and libraries and community events.
No libraries, they wouldn't have me.
Libraries wouldn't have me. But you've got your book, your wonderful book, Harold, the Boy Who Became Mark Twain, is replete with stories of you and your first wife, Ruby, going on tour in the Midwest, going from town to town, playing the high school auditoriums. Really kind of an extraordinary way to start out. You weren't discovered at Schwab's, you were discovered in the high school auditorium. Yeah, okay, well, we'll go on from there.
Okay.
But it must have been a kind of a tough life to go from Peru, Nebraska to Kirksville, Missouri to Topeka, Kansas in 3 days.
Yeah, it was. In the beginning, it's a little confusing because to begin with, my first wife, Ruby, and I created this two-person show. We did some Shakespeare. We did a thing about Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which I wrote. We did all kinds of characters from history, including Mark Twain. And after the school assembly thing, and after we played women's clubs and colleges for about 4 years, we had a child that ended the two-person routine. So I had to develop, I had to earn a living. And developing the Mark Twain solo was just truly and honestly just a way to get bread on the table. We had moved to New York. We had no parents who could help us in any way. We had about $200 in the bank. The only way we had to earn a living was the two-person show, and she couldn't travel anymore. So I, in desperation, developed this solo show. And at that point, you know, I wasn't playing high schools anymore. I was playing colleges and mostly universities and college. So it was a little bit different, and I only did one show a day. I didn't have to do 2 shows a day in different towns the way we did with the two-person show. When we started out, we had a station wagon. We played 307 shows in 30 weeks in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, a little bit of Missouri, Louisiana. We had to travel at 80, 85 miles an hour on 2-lane highways because we did 2 and 3 shows a day. It was only a 5-day week. It was a school, and we did 2 and 3 shows a day, and usually about 12 shows a week. And you really had to learn to drive like a maniac, you know.
Well, you've got one story in the book about you had to get from, I think it's Matheson, Mississippi to Dumas, Texas, and you're going 85 miles an hour.
It's called Dumas.
Dumas, yeah, sorry, Dumas. Yeah. And the car flips over in the rain. You're going through the rain at 85 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And most of us would take that moment to maybe take a vacation from the road.
Well, we couldn't. I couldn't because the car went over in just east of West Point, Mississippi. And it was a Sunday morning, and we came over a viaduct, and I knew I had to keep the car at 80 miles an hour all the way to Dumas. It was from Matheson, Mississippi to Dumas was, I think, 900 miles. No, 750 miles, and we'd covered about 150. And I knew I had to keep it at 80 miles an hour to make it. And we went over. I came off a viaduct. It was a new blacktop road going straight across the state. And it had been raining. And I'm very careful with rain now. And we came off the viaduct, and I checked the speed to make sure we were up to 80 again, and I saw there's gravel on the road down below, you know, some gravel, too late, a farm truck or something. And I thought, boy, I hope this doesn't cause trouble. And the minute we hit the gravel, the wheel went dead, the car started moving like a ghost to this side of the road. There's new blacktop. It was through the piney woods, the red clay, and the blacktop was about that high above the clay. And I knew if we hit and a big drop-off on each side, probably 8 to 10 foot drop-off, you know, to the woods. And
you ended up upside down.
Yeah, we finally, you know, I tried to let it go and got near this side of the road, and then I just tapped the brake, just tapped it, and the car went boom and started going this way. I thought if I could get, I made a mistake. I should have accelerated, but I wasn't that good a driver. And I thought if I could get the 2 right wheels off in the mud, maybe it'd slow me down enough and I could stop so I wouldn't flip the car over. But the minute we hit the mud, and the girl who was replacing my wife, Ruby, while she was pregnant, was in the seat sleeping. And I held onto the wheel and put my hand on her, and the car hit that mud, and you know, it was like an animal shaking the wheel out of my hand, twisted it, even twisted the steering wheel. And we started over, and I turned the engine off while we were going over so we wouldn't blow up, and put my hand on Lee, and we went right down and landed on my head. And it was really something. And anyway, the point is, she went into town with somebody, and we got a record, came out, and we still had to make that date. We stood on the road, and I'm thinking, not only I'm glad to be alive, and the wheels are upside down, and the steam is rising off the underside of the car, and you can see everything exposed there. And I'm thinking, how am I going to make Dumas? And truly, I mean, you know, that's the way I thought.
But you made it.
And we made it. We stopped for 2 hours in Wichita Falls in a motel, get 2 hours of sleep, and all the way telegraphed ahead it was an evening show, to the man in charge, and said, please have the school open so we can get in, and da-da-da. Got there and nothing. It was locked up, nobody was around. We were very angry. I was very angry. And we got the show ready, and the audience was so wonderful, it took all my anger away. And we had a good time. And that was the end of it.
And so you're doing these tours, and you're playing places that you describe the combination basketball court and theater in these high schools and whatnot. That probably helped your projection to, you know. Well,
yeah. In those days, we didn't use microphones. People actually could hear better than they can today, I guess. I went to the theater in New York. Nobody ever had a microphone, you know. I heard the lunch, Helen Hayes, perfectly fine. But anyway, when you're on the road in those days, we were played all kinds of places, and we had to learn to project. Well, you had to be heard, so one way or another, you learned to project, use your voice. And, you know, it was unbelievable, kind of different. I remember once we had a show in Reagan High School in Houston. It was Reagan Senior High School, which to us was like playing the big time, because we were going to play senior high school. Wouldn't be any little kids in the first several rows, you know. And when it was a morning assembly, and when the principal came back to introduce, he was nervous. And I thought, uh-oh, this is bad news. When the principal was nervous, you knew you had to get nervous, because that meant he was afraid of his students. And if they were going to take over, he wasn't in charge. And that was true. And when I stepped out in front of the curtain to introduce the show, that place went into wild rodeo hysteria. Yeah, you know, all those cowboys and cowgirls out there, and they just went into hysteria. And I knew I couldn't get angry because I'd lose it. And so every time I would try to open my mouth and say anything, this was our big date we'd been looking forward to for weeks. The audience would go, ah, you know, and start yelling and not let me speak. And this went on for about almost 10 minutes. I couldn't, every time I tried, then he slowed down and let me say 2 words, and then he stopped. And I had to keep my temper, and wait and see what happened. And finally, they gave me a little bit longer, and I thought I had an idea. And when an opening occurred, I said, "This show stinks." And they started to laugh, and then they gave me another, and I say, "You don't want to see this, it stinks." And then they started laughing, and I said, "Look, we're only getting $35 for this show, and we only get $21.60 out of it. The manager gets the rest. But it stinks, you're not going to like it. Don't listen." And then they started quieting down, and I said, "We're just going to go ahead and start so we can collect our money. We're only going to do 2 numbers. But don't listen, it stinks." And finally they calmed down, and we did the Mark Twain number, which is what we ended the shows with for the schools, was an interview with Mark Twain, because it was the one thing that the kids would listen to, with Twain. You know, they would listen. They enjoyed it.
It was the interviewer and Mark Twain. The interviewer had a very small part, if I remember.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't so small. Ruby was a very important person because we were in high school and she was good looking. When she came out in green tights playing Rosalind and As You Like It, boy, I tell the whole place went up.
Well, your mother and father play a major role in the book by their absence. Your growing up time, which was split between Cleveland, Ohio, and Massachusetts, South Weymouth, Massachusetts, it's really about their absence. Tell us a little bit about your father and mother and what that meant to you in your childhood.
Well, we were only told about our father and mother because we didn't see them.
You and your two sisters, you had two sisters?
Yeah, I had two sisters, June and Alberta, and Alberta was 1, I was 2, and June was 3. It was 1, 2, 3. And when our mother disappeared, I was 2. That's what I'm told. And they never talked about them. We didn't know why they went, and they would say, well, we'll tell you someday or whatever, but they never told us. It was basically New England people. I came from New England people. They're not known for their Southern hospitality like Dixie Carter is. There's a whole world of difference between the South and New England. And the whole idea of the theater was I never realized was anathema to my family, because when I was 12 years old, I got into the trunk room, and there was an open trunk, and it was my mother's touring trunk, and I found out she was in show business. I had never been told my mother was in show business. I didn't know anything about show business. I had no desire to be in show business. I never even thought of it. But she was a chorus girl. That was not very nice. And they disappeared, and my father followed, and my grandfather, who took care of us. My grandfather was a shoe man. He had some shoe stores, one in Cleveland, one in Columbus, one in Boston, Pittsburgh, and he was our real champion. He was our protector. At the age of 60 years old, my grandfather took these 3 little babies down to South Weymouth, Massachusetts, where he'd built a home for his mother. And he raised us. I mean, he was gone most of the time. He had somebody take care of us, but he raised us. And he was like our champion. He died when I was 12 years old, and we knew he was sick. We heard these howling coming out of his room, and the doctors were in there, and they closed the door and wouldn't let us in. And then we were told that we were going to go in and say goodbye to Grandpa, and nobody told us, but we knew that that was going to be it. We wouldn't see our grandfather again, and we were going to be taken to Cleveland to live with my grandmother. And when I went in to say goodbye to my grandfather, he was in the bed, and he was not smiling. And he reached out his hand, and he said, "Come here, buddy." He called me buddy. I can still remember the feeling of his hand on my head, my grandfather. He put my hand out. He said, he said, "Come here." Took my hand. His hand was so strong and smooth. And he said, "I want you to promise me something, Harold." I said, "What?" "I want you to go to Culver Military Academy." I don't know what the heck that was. "Will you do that?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Good boy." And that was it. That was my goodbye.
So you went to Culver?
I did go to Culver Military Academy, and when I got to the high school age, and while it was tough because I had so much regimentation, and I've been through so much regimentation since I was 7 years old and sent away to a boarding school for 4 years. But I realized later on that my grandfather knew that would save my life. He knew, and in those days, they saved the life of the boy first. My sisters had a terrible time. But he saved my life because he put me in a protected environment for 4 years, just at the time when I could have gotten in a lot of trouble like my sisters did. My oldest sister, June, ran away with somebody. He got on the Nickel Plate Railroad and rode the boxcars all the way to California, for example, you know.
And there's a choice in your life at Culver. Military school, but you got involved in the theater program there. But you were also a runner, and there's a moment at which you have to make a choice. You talk about in the book between running and
yeah,
and
there
theater.
was. I was a distance runner, and when my freshman year, the coach was a tough guy. Mike Carpenter was all-star from Alabama football team. And, you know, I came in a lot behind everybody else, but he took me on all the trips. He must have seen something in me, I don't know. And by the time I got to my senior year, you know, it was time for me to win, to be #1 on the team. Try to beat Baxter from Iowa, who was terrific in the mile. And I had won the cross-country race in the fall for the first time. And then I got involved in the theater my senior year. Bunch of weirdos in the school, you know, weirdos. But I had to get an extra hour of credit because I flunked algebra, and I was taking a big, heavy course, an extra course, and I needed one more hour. It couldn't be astronomy. Astronomy was out. We used the chapel credit, and Perry Warren Fisk, who was a very effete kind of guy in the dramatics class, and I didn't want to fool around with these guys. They were strange. And he said, why don't you take dramatics, Harry? And I said, I like Perry very much. I used to kid around with him. He was fun. He was funny. I said, no, Perry, I didn't want to tell him I don't want to be with you guys, but I said, no, Perry, I wouldn't dare get out on the stage, you know. I said, well, Major Mather will only give you maybe one line or something. You won't have it. I said, no, thanks, Perry. Yeah, thanks a lot, but I couldn't do that. And then he said, there's no homework. I said, what? No homework? He said, no. That did it. So I went out for the, and I slowly grew to like these people. They were very, very unmilitary. They got me in a lot of trouble doing things like making gin on the top of the barracks. I had a gin.
You crawled through the air ducts. You almost were rusticated.
You see, I had this impish quality. Like I used to do crazy things, I guess, to attract attention. They had above the door, the two guys to a room in the barracks. Above the door, they had a vent, and you could take a box-shaped thing, you could take it out, and you could just manage to scroll through the vent. So I would balance on the door, and my roommate, George Livingston, would think, here he goes again, you know. I'm just going to crawl down the ventilator shaft for a while and scare people. So I would get I would crawl through there. It was very hard on the knees because it was in the shaft, there was these little wires and things. And I would crawl down the hall for a while to somebody else's vent, and I would go, and they would guys in the room would say, what's that? His roommate would say, what? That noise. I don't know. I would just be laughing. I would have such fun. So one night I went down to because we were gonna scare Perry Warren Fisk's roommate. So I went down to Perry's room and I went, Perry's trying to remain not hysterical, and he says, and his roommate says, "What's that?" No, Perry says, "What's that?" And his roommate says, "What do you mean, the noise up there?" Perry said, "Yeah." What do you think it is? And his roommate says, "It's some fool up there making a noise. What do you think?" Who could it be? Holbrook, who do you think? I crawled out of the vent. We were laughing ourselves silly. I crawled out of the vent. It was after lights out, military school. And I would balance on the top of the door, and I was just putting the vent back. I looked down, and I see these Colonel's bars on the shoulder of this uniform, as Colonel Johnson was there. I looked down at these round blue eyes, and Colonel Johnson, and I said, "Oh, sir, I was just investigating a noise up here." He said, "Please don't test my patience, Holbrook. Come down here." So I jumped off the door and saluted. He said, "I will see you in my office in the morning. Get to bed." And so I was a PFC. It was my senior year. I had made PFC, and they broke me.
So a very successful career at Culver Military Academy, but you did discover the theater there, and you go on to Denison College. You make a choice to go to Denison because of the theater program.
Yeah, I was very fortunate in the choice of college. It's a long story, but I ended up at this liberal arts college in Ohio that had an absolutely marvelous teacher, a wonderful teacher. Edward A. Wright was the head of he created the theater department there. A lot of our boys, he did not encourage you to go into the theater. He did not push you into it. But a remarkable number of people that I was in school with ended up in the theater doing some pretty good stuff. And I was very fortunate to go there. And Ed had grown up in Iowa, Marshalltown, Iowa. And as a young man, he'd gone on the circuit in the tent shows, doing a solo, doing impersonations, his solo act, impersonations of people and things. And we used to drive him to his dates. He would amplify his professorial income by playing the Kiwanis Club in Chillicothe or whatever, and we would drive him. And he had the most wonderful sense of timing. His sense of timing was so extraordinary. He could control an audience like nobody I ever saw. He did these outrageous, corny things, but, characters, like the major character he did was Elmer Warts, the champion hog collar of the state of Indiana, accepting his award when he came home from all his friends. But it was so funny. You just died laughing. And I learned a great deal from Ed. I learned a great deal from him in many ways. Really, my whole career I owe to my teacher, because he really taught us respect for the profession of the actor. He taught us that our responsibility was to perform for the audience, not ourselves. He didn't encourage effetism and exclusivity and all that kind of stuff. He was very serious about what we did, but we had a wonderful time together.
You tell a story about encountering Ruth Draper, who was one of the great monologists of the, and you got to drive her at Denison at one point.
Yeah.
After she'd driven you, she she talked about your Midwestern
Yeah,
roots.
well, Ruth Draper was the great monologuist. It was a monologuist, basically. I suppose that's what you could say I was doing. And she had a great career. She played like London and New York, and she was playing Swayze Chapel at my college in Denison. And Ruby, my first wife, and I were ready to go on the road, and we had to travel to start a tour in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was a long trip. And Ruth Draper was playing in the chapel that night, and Ed said, would you like to drive Ruth Draper up to the chapel just so you could meet her? He said, oh yeah. So we delayed our departure so that we could drive her up to the chapel. And in the course of it, trying to be modest, I had to inform her that we too were in the theater, you know. We were leaving that night to go to Fort Smith and perform and all that. You know, I tried to be very modest, but she was quite silent about it all. And we got her there, and later, we left, and later Ed told me that she had said to him, how does that young man ever expect to achieve anything in the theater with that horrible Midwestern accent?
She's looking down on us now, finding out about it. So Ed Wright gives you the idea for the Mark Twain sketch, and you've worked on these other sketches, the Elizabeth and Essex, and the Brownings, and Victoria and Albert, et cetera. And you've created this with your wife, initially out of Denison. And do you remember the first time you did this? The Rotary, the Suicide Ward, and the Rotary Club.
Yeah, the first time we did the Mark Twain sketch was in the Suicide Ward of the Chillicothe Veterans Hospital. And Dick Welsbacher, who incidentally is retired from the college in Wichita, and I'm going to see him in 2 days. I'm going to be there. We're going to have dinner. We went to school together. He was the best actor in school. And he and his wife, Betty, did a musical thing, and they were going to perform, and Ruby and I. And we arrived, and, you know, we go into this great big room with the windows real high so nobody could get out. And these guys are all standing around kind of looking, you know. And we get a table, we get our setup ready, and we start our show. And the guys are, I mean, the audience, if you could call it that, they're looking, some of them are looking at us like, are these people dangerous? And some of them are looking around like, looking at the windows to see if they could get out. They don't know who these people are, or whether they're dangerous or whatever. And so I couldn't figure out what was it, were there any laughs here? I was trying to think, do we have any laughs in this material? Trying to translate some of the, you know, sounds into, could it be a response? And nobody knew. And in the car afterwards, I would say to Dick and Ruby and Betty, you know, I think, remember when I said, you know, he's dead? They made this sound, could that be a laugh? And nobody said a word. I didn't know what we had. And then we played the Kiwanis Club in Newark, Ohio, and they laughed at the same places the people were going, So we didn't know who was crazy and who was straight.
This audience is looking pretty good to you, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, you've got Mark Twain in your bag of tricks at this point, but you see Emlyn Williams, the great Welsh actor and playwright, Emlyn Williams, doing Charles Dickens. You remember that performance?
Mm-hmm. I do. Yeah.
And you thought at that point that maybe you could do something
well, later on, you know, in the back of my mind, I wouldn't even presume to think that I could do anything like that. But later on, you know, when I did the solo show, which was 6 years later, I developed it 6 years later. When we were in New York, we had a baby, and somebody else was taking Ruby's part, you know, that had the accident with me, but it wasn't the same because the two of us were married. Ruby and I were married, and the women and all, everybody thought that was so charming and lovely, so it wasn't going to work anymore. And so I had to develop, I had to get money, I had to get food on the table. That was it. And I was afraid. The idea of going out alone on the stage was so scary to me, I can't even tell you. I was never able to get up and give a speech. I would get so mixed up, I wouldn't know what to say. But I was driven by the need to get bread on the table. And I knew the people who had booked us, the managers, we'd been quite successful in a little way, in a little tiny way of show business on the road, and I knew I could get booked. And a friend of mine was the son of Mark Twain's lecture manager, Major Pond, and Bim Pond, his son, is a friend of mine, and he was a very grumpy man, very gruff, and no kidding around about nothing. And I went to him one day, and I said, and he knew the business. He'd booked Ruth Draper and a lot of famous people. And I said, Bim, do you think that I can get bookings with somebody besides Ruby? He didn't answer me. He was a very tough, gruff man. He said, why don't you do a solo? I said, what? You mean Mark Twain? Yeah. A solo? I said, go out alone on the stage? I think you could get booked. That's all he said. Nothing. And I walked out of there. I walked down on the street, and I started walking around. It was downtown in New York, and I thought, oh my gosh, how could I do this? Oh, I just didn't know. The whole idea was frightening. And then sometime later, I went to the Argosy bookstore, secondhand bookstore on 59th Street near Bloomingdale. I said, where is the Mark Twain section? And they pointed someplace upstairs, and I went up and looked around. I didn't know anything about Twain. I was just playing him as an old man, and the sketch with Ruby was nothing. And I started picking out these books, and over the next year or two, I found books about him and books of stuff he'd read that wasn't just Tom Sawyer, it wasn't even Huckleberry Finn. When I first picked out Huckleberry Finn, I don't think I'd ever read a book by Mark Twain. I was feeling really lousy. I was feeling, my marriage was not going well. After we had a child, it was very difficult for Ruby. And everything was down. She was gone in Canada with her sister, and I was really depressed. I would walk sometimes 100 blocks just to walk it off, to go home. And I picked up this Tom Sawyer thing. I don't even do anything from Tom Sawyer now, but I picked this book up. And I started reading, well, okay. And I started reading, and by the time I get to the second or third page, I'm starting to feel better. This is not so bad. I was just starting to feel better. Made me feel better. I thought, oh, this is not so bad. And so that started me going, and I read that. I didn't want to read Huckleberry Finn because I didn't like to see that word nigger in there. It took me a while to understand why the word is used and how great the book is, despite its imperfections as a piece of literature. It's one of the great, great books of modern writing. And the book and the name that some people have taken out of the book or put out an edition without the name, without the word nigger in it. But that word is the most important word in Huckleberry Finn. Hard as it is to hear it, hard as it is to explain it, hard as it is to hear it, it's the most important word in Huckleberry Finn because he uses it over 200 times, not by accident. This is too great a writer, and if you know anything about his background and his friendship with people like Frederick Douglass and you know all this other stuff he wrote, many things like the United States of Lynching. If you know anything about Mark Twain, the reason he used the word over 200 times is because it's like a sledgehammer on the head of the reader to remind you what the book is about and to get at your own feelings about racism and get at your own feelings about how you feel, no matter how you might try to hide them. That's what the word is there for, is to remind you what the book is about. Plus, of course, that's the way people talked. I mean, when I was growing up in South Weymouth, even in Cleveland later, I mean, my family was nice white people, middle class. They used the word. So it's not so far away, you know. Anyway, and then I started reading books, you know, about his speeches and his essays about war and his essays about the press and the corruption of the press, a speech called License of the Press, in which he excoriates the press for its use of inaccurate information to prove a point for itself or for a political party or something.
Thank God that doesn't happen anymore.
No. That's right, Crosby. Thank God it doesn't happen anymore. And, you know, I mean, when I do that number today, sometimes the people applaud because it's right on. I mean, now you got the Fox News on one side, MSNBC on the other, and both of them are distorting information so badly, nobody can find out what the facts are anymore. We live in a democracy. That's used to be. And in a democracy, if you can't get facts, if you can't get the truth, how can you have a democracy? You don't have a democracy anymore if you can't get the truth. And so he has a lot to say about that. Believe me, and I never change Mark Twain's. I don't rewrite what he says. I edit a lot of his material together to create a selection or a number, as I call a number. Like I think about press, I think about Congress, I think about it is a compilation of stuff that he said here, which I put together because it all fits together. It just fits together. Sounds like he wrote it that way because it's his words. Nobody can rewrite Mark Twain. Anybody thinks they can write like Mark Twain is dreaming. You know, they can't, because the essence of Twain's ability as a writer is so subtly, the way he gets to a truth is not threatening. He's not like some of these guys on HBO, which are pounding you over the head with their liberal, you know, philosophy, and, you know, they're talking to the choir of 20% of the people in America. Mark Twain can talk to everybody. Anybody can understand him. And if he says something like this to me is like almost the essence of the way Mark Twain can get a point over. And this is a quote. the noblest man is the noblest work of God. Who found that out? Takes a little while, see? Takes a little while. But you know, you do have to stop and think a little bit about that. Who found that out? Yep. And that's another thing I love what Twain said, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect.
Now, one of the interesting things about your career is that at this very moment when you're creating what ultimately won you Emmys, worldwide acclaim, huge audiences, your Mark Twain Tonight, at the very time you're creating that, you abandon it for a while because you get a real job.
Yeah, I got a job on a soap opera.
On a soap opera, Brighter Day.
Yeah, it was you know, sometimes life, you know, things that happen in your life and mine, it's like you can't, looking back, you can't hardly believe, how did this happen? How did this, what was this, some kind of magic or something? You know, well, it's not magic, it's just something happened. I worked very hard for a year, working up a 50-minute show so I could play a college in Pennsylvania with Twain. I had some dates, and a 50-minute assembly. And I did it, and anyway, it went well. But the thing is, just when I got the show all about ready to go, after like 2 years of walking pavements in New York and auditioning, I auditioned 5 times for a soap opera, going from radio to television. That was the way, in 1954, radio soaps were going to television. 5 times I got the part. It was one of the greatest thrills of my life, because I was now assured that I would probably get about $200 a week for a year. And if I was lucky, they'd pick me up and I'd go for another year. I could count on $200. $200 a week was a fortune to me, my wife and our little baby. And so I thought, I don't need Mark Twain anymore, so I'll put him in the suitcase and put it in the closet.
And you're looking for acting jobs in other acting jobs in New York, and you encounter the CBS casting director.
Yeah, well, that came a little bit later, but what happened was, what's weird is, after I'd been doing after I'd been doing the soap for about a year, a friend of mine who was a singer, Lovelady Powell was her name. That was actually her name, Lovey Powell. She was a wonderful cabaret singer. She started out on the North Beach in San Francisco, back there in the good time. You know, they had some really terrific people out there, that in the Purple Onion and Hungry Eye and people like that on the North Beach. That's where the cabaret started. A lot of these great comedians started out there. And Lovey sang, and she called me up one day. We'd gone to school together, and said, Milt Kamen, the comedian, is going on vacation, and they're auditioning to replace him for 3 weeks. Why don't you get your wig and costume and come down and audition for the job? I said, Lovey, are you nuts? Mark Twain in a nightclub? Are you crazy? She said, Hal, this is cabaret, whatever that is. She said, anything goes. Why don't you do it? And I said, well, I don't know, but I'll think about it. But I did, and I thought, you know, I worked so hard for a year to put this thing together. Maybe I just ought to give it a shot, see what it's like. So I did. I auditioned. And, you know, the owner was there, and a couple of people wandered off the street. And I auditioned. And they put me on. And I played this club for 3 weeks, and it was really tough because it was a totally different thing. It was a very small audience. And then Lovey and I wanted to start a club of our own. She was a star, she was a singer. And so we opened a club down in the village and on Grove Street, and I named it upstairs at the duplex, or above the duplex bar and grill. We had to build a sound wall by ourselves, sound wall to keep the bar noise out. And it became quite a successful little club. 59 people by the fire thing on the wall. And I developed the first 2 hours of my Mark Twain material in the curve of a baby grand piano at one end of this room.
And you're doing your soap opera at the same time.
And I was doing the soap opera, and sometimes I was doing the soap for 2 and 3 and 4 days a week. So, I mean, I was developing new material all the time to do in the club, and I was riding the IRT subway, 7th Avenue, down to Grove Street, down to Sheridan Square, from up at 108th Street, and I was really working hard. I was also running the club, you know, sometimes I'm up till 3 or 4 in the morning, but I learned my lines on the back of the subway, and then one night, through a friend of mine who did this without my knowing anything about it, he knew somebody who knew Ed Sullivan. And he got Ed Sullivan to come to the club. I was making up one night, and the guy was on our door, and the maitre d' came down and said, "Ed Sullivan's out there." Holy mackerel, are you kidding? Yeah, Ed Sullivan, he's sitting right in front of you. Okay, so I went out and I didn't know what to do, and I did something that accident insurance said, I knew it was the wrong thing to do, but I did it anyway, because it was funny to me. And when it was over, Ed asked me to come up. He was there with his old pugilist friend who used to go around the clubs. You know, he really went out and looked for people. Ed Sullivan really went out and looked for people himself. He didn't send somebody. And he came and found me. And he said, I sat down with him, and between shows he said, Hal, you got any other material than that? I said, yeah, I know that wasn't the right thing to do, but I don't know what happened to me. I just said, what do you got? And so I explained some stuff to him. He said, well, look, can you come to my apartment tomorrow and do that for me, Hal? And I said, yes, sir. Where is it? In Park Avenue, 59th Street. Some fancy place. I went in, and I went the next day, and his wife answered the door and called me called me Hal. And they had this beautiful apartment, you know, and she said, Ed is waiting for you in the living room. And I went in, and the beautiful French chairs, and I sat down, and he's sitting there, and he said, what do you got for me, Hal? And so I started to tell him. He said, why don't you just do it? So I sat in this chair, and I did this thing about all the things you do to be old, like smoke a lot, drink a lot, everything, you know, the worst thing you could do. And he said, he didn't smile. He smiled a little, but he didn't laugh. And I thought, I'm drowning, I'm dying. And he said, can you cut that to 6 minutes, Hal? And I thought, that'll ruin it, but what am I going to say? I said, yes, sir, I can. And so he said, who's your agent? I said, I don't have an agent, Mr. Sullivan. He looked at me, you know, he said, you don't have an agent? I said, no, sir. Well, how much do you want, Hal? I'm telling you, at that moment, I realized I had never thought of being paid. I had never, ever thought of being paid. I mean, that wasn't part of what I was doing. And suddenly I thought, how much do I want? I don't know. Let's see. The Beatles, they probably get $1,000. I thought, that's too much. I thought, maybe you could ask for 200. No, that's too little. Oh, how much? So I'm going like, well, Sir, would $500 be all right? And he said, you got a deal, Hal. And he put me on, and he was really nice to me. He was really, really nice to me, and he gave me a wonderful introduction, just like all the big-time folks. You know, everybody. I don't know, or a lot of you, all you got some gray hair here. You know what Ed Sullivan's show was. That was the big time, and I had no idea. I didn't even stop to think of it like getting paid, you know, that it would make a tremendous difference in being able to book Mark Twain, but it did. You know, I got a better fee already, and pretty soon, the next thing you know, a couple of years down the line, we started thinking about maybe we could do this off-Broadway. And I went out in front of that audience, and it ends the book, actually, and my knees were shaking. I was frightened out of my wits. I was always very confident when I put on the makeup. By then, it was about 2.5, 3 hours to do the makeup. And once I got into makeup, and once I got the costume on, the padding and everything, I felt strong. I felt impregnable in Mark Twain's persona. And I thought I was going to be okay. But the minute I walked out on that little stage and the lights hit me, I thought to myself, Holbrook, this is not the Oklahoma Panhandle kid. You are now in front of the major critics in New York City, and you're taking up their time with your little road act, and you are going to get murdered. And I was frightened out of my wits. And in the reviews, they would talk about how my shake, you know, the shaking, as if it was part of the character. It was me shaking. It was not Mark Twain. It was me shaking, my knees, my hands. I mean, I dropped the masters on the ground. I thought, there goes my laugh, you know. And when it was over, we went to the one of the backers' apartment, and our Harvey Sabinson, our press agent, comes in with the reviews and starts to read the New York Times review. Well, I always remember the way it began. A young actor named Hal Holbrook appeared on stage last night as 70-year-old Mark Twain. There should have been posters up all over town to announce his arrival. And it went on with tremendous rage. Unbelievable. Unbelievable to me. Walter Kerr wrote a rave. Every single paper in the United States, and every Newsweek and Time, every single one was a rave. I think Life magazine did 7 pages on us, and they said it was the best set of reviews since My Fair Lady. Just to give you an idea, you know, what a shock this was, because the thing that was the shock about it is I didn't believe it. I really didn't believe it. I'm not kidding you. I couldn't believe it. Because I traveled all over the country. I played Wahoo, Nebraska, Alice, Texas, Marfa, Texas. I played all over this country. Nobody ever made a big fuss over me. And I go to New York City, the frightening place of all, and they make a big fuss over me, and I couldn't believe it. And I still have trouble believing it. And it frightened the life out of me. It scared me because I thought, what do I do now? And 2 days after I opened, that wonderful actress, Margaret Sullivan, this is how the book ends, incidentally, which is the reason for writing the second book. A wonderful actress, Margaret Sullivan, beautiful, long-legged, beautiful woman. I saw her in The Voice of the Turtle. I fell in love with her. Saw her in Boston when I was in the Army in the war. And she came back with the playwright, what's his name, that wrote Mornings at 7. Can't remember anybody's name. Mornings at 7 he wrote. And she looked at me with these blue eyes, candid blue eyes, and she said, "What are you going to do now, Mr. Holbrook?" I said, "What?" Of course, I knew what she meant, but I didn't know what to say. And I said, "What?" She said, "How will you ever find another character as rich as this? How will you ever top this?" End of book. And then it gave me the reason to start the second book because, aside from the fact that I've lived a lot longer, is because I realized nobody knew who I was. I had disguised myself so thoroughly. Nobody knew who I was. The show had got phenomenal reviews, but Mark Twain was the star. They didn't know what I looked like. Nobody had ever heard of me. I never did a show I never did a play in New York. I never did a big TV show. I was on a soap opera, which in those days is the worst thing you could say you were on. And I had to start all over again at the age of 34, and I had to find out, in the course of starting over, I had to find out, finally, if I could, still trying to, who I was, who that little boy was on the cover of that book there.
Well, that search for the real Hal Holbrook goes on.
Yeah.
So can we bring you back when you publish the second book?
Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Hal Holbrook.
Thank you very much.